Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and so here we are at the end of my review of all of the Valdemar books that I had previously read and enjoyed. So this is the collection of all of the ones that I personally own. As you can see, I don't actually have a complete personal collection. Actually, I'm reasonably sure that I own Oathbreakers, but I could not for the life of me find it. So, there you go. I will probably find Oathbreakers about 3.5 minutes after I finish this video and feel like a complete moron for not realizing where I'd put it. That's neither here nor there. So, when I started this, I set out to read these in what was effectively chronological order. That is, starting at the events within the context of the series that happened at the earliest point in time, finishing with the events that happen at the latest point in time, again, within the context of the series. And so I read the books in the following order. As you can see, I'm just so excitingly fantastic with doing, pictures and things. So I started with the Mage Wars, which, I've put the initial publication dates next to each title. I realize in retrospect that I probably should have picked a different color for the Exiles duology and for Arrows, but it's a little late now. Anyways, so as you can see, the Mage Wars trilogy came out 94, 95, 96, which was the same year as the Mage Storms trilogy, 94, 95, 96, because the two sets were kind of meant to be read contemporaneously. That is, what's going on in Black Griffin is the story that effectively bookends the Mage Storms. The end of Black Griffin is the cause of the Mage Storms that appear in Storm Warning. The thing about White Griffin and Silver Griffin is that both of those books, we are introduced in effect to the Khaleda in Mage Winds, and White Griffin and Silver Griffin basically tell the story of where the Khaleda Inn went, where they wound up, how they wound up there, what was happening with them, so that you can sort of internally fill in what was doing with these people in between when they got separated from the rest of Urtho's army and where they were and what they were doing up until they sent Traven and Hydona to meet up with the Teledras in the years before Mage Winds. The Last Herald Mage trilogy, which is the second set chronologically, as you can see, was begun literally 5 years before the Mage Wars came out. And so, it predates them in terms of publication order, in terms of the order at the time at which people would have written them, but the events of The Last Herald Mage are the earliest events that we have out of these novels. Now, there are a lot of short story collections, but the thing about those short story collections is that the short story collections are basically, for the most part, collections written by people other than Mercedes Lackey. There are a few stories that she wrote, but basically those stories are written by other people and edited by Mercedes Lackey. So I frankly don't really count them, in a lot of ways I don't count them as part of the series. On the one hand, she is very, very stringent about this sort of thing, so I have to assume that anything anybody sent her, she would have ensured fit within her canon. But given the inconsistencies between the story that is told in Take a Thief, and the story that we hear in Arrows and in Winds in terms of Skiff. And there are inconsistencies, and they are inconsistencies that have to do with what Skiff is actually telling people. I can't be entirely certain that those books really can be considered to fit properly into the continuity. That said, if you as a reader, A, enjoyed them, and B, feel that they fit entirely in the continuity, that's totally your choice. Now you'll notice the Collegium Chronicles 2008 to 2013 were written, literally 20 years after Last Herald Mage. They take place actually not too long after the end of Magic's Price, all things considered. Like, Foundation, the gap between the Mage Wars and Last Herald Mage is several thousand years. It is at least 2,000 years based on the timeline that Ms. Lackey has at the beginning of many of her books. Whereas at the end of Magic's Price and the start of Foundation, the difference between those is maybe a generation. Mags in Foundation meets up with, he runs into a person who was personally taught by Stefan, that is, Vaniel's life bond, that Vaniel had his life bonded bard, and Mags meets him at Solstice, at, pseudo-Christmas. Herald Spy obviously follows up immediately on Collegium Chronicles, not really important. Then we get to Brightly Burning, which happens effectively in between, as I was doing things chronologically, but it was written 10 years after Last Herald Mage and 8 years before the start of the Collegium Chronicles. So, these were very much published out of chronological order. And indeed, By the Sword remains a slightly problematic one. I slotted it there as 10, but I'll be honest with you, By the Sword starts, before Exiles and ends after Arrow's Fall. So that particular book, for all that, you sort of slotted in there at 10, it's sort of taking place during all of those. It's a slightly problematic placement in terms of describing what's going on and when it is. But this is the chronological order. The thing is, though, when you talk about these books, I would advise, if you aren't going to be reading them just in order of publication, which I think is a perfectly fine order. In fact, it is sort of the order that I would advise simply because it's a heck of a lot easier to look up. I do have a personal order that I gave some thought to this, and I'm also fascinated that the Owl trilogy was written right after the Mage Storms, because frankly it feels in a lot of ways very, very distant from them. It's understandable, but it really does feel so distant. Anyways, so you can see this order, and I will put the books down in the description below in the two orders that I recommend them. But the order that I recommend that they be read in, as opposed to just doing them chronologically, if you have decided to begin this series on my advice, I don't know why anyone would begin reading anything on my advice, this is the order that I would recommend. I would recommend starting with Arrows, and then following this up with Last Herald Mage. Yes, partly because these two were the first ones published, but it is also to do with the fact that these two trilogies rather, they set up what Valdemar is. They set up the story of Valdemar. They set up how heralds work. The Last Herald Mage very much explains this whole issue of mages and why there can be mages over with Ankar and in Hardorn, but there aren't any. Well, actually, no, it doesn't really, but it does. It gives you this background. It gives you this broader history. Now, you'll notice I've put Vows and Honor in position number 3. And that's because By the Sword requires you to have read, really, I feel By the Sword, you should have read Oathbound, Oathbreakers, and Oathblood before reading By the Sword so that you know where you are and where everything is, so that you know where Carowin actually came from. And so reading that, so you need to read these books. Now, Oathblood, 1998, but let's be honest, Oathbound and Oathbreakers are both 1989. They were both done more or less at the same time that Magic's Pawn was being done. They were published the same year. So, so far I'm more or less following order of publication except for Oathblood. The thing about this, though, is I would very much suggest, sort of reading the trilogies as trilogies and just sort of having that story be constant, because while Mage Wars and Mage Storms can be read sort of alternating Black Griffin, Storm Warning, White Griffin, Storm Rising, and Silver Griffin, Storm Breaking, the fact is that I think that it would be better to have read them straight through before reading Mage Storms. So now we start getting to some things that are actually different than the initial order of publication. For one thing, I think that the Owl Trilogy should be read after everything. Whether you decide that, you're going to read it after the prequels, whether you're going to read it after Collegium Chronicles and Herald Spy, I just very much think that you might as well read them separately, because the Owl Trilogy is, in many, many ways, so very, very distant from what was going on in Arrows, Mage Winds, and Mage Storms. It's so distant, it really might as well be happening on another planet. And I don't think it should be read as a follow-up to Stormbreaking, because it isn't. I mean, sure, chronologically it happens afterwards, but it's not following it up. It's just kind of, and by the way, elsewhere afterwards, stuff happened. I think instead, after Mage Storms, that you should read Brightly Burning, because that's a story that you have heard about. Now, Brightly Burning should perhaps be read after The Last Herald Mage. There is something to be said for reading it after The Last Herald Mage, and that's because it's another story that we heard in the course of Arrows, because in Arrows we heard The Last Herald Mage and the Brightly Burning stories mentioned, discussed, brought up, and raised. The prequels, again, they're separate. The Collegium Chronicles, these are very, very separate things from the stuff on the left-hand side. Because the stuff on the left-hand side is very much sort of all of a piece in terms of who's there or when it's happening, whereas the things on the other side are filling in a lot of blanks. So you can take or leave my suggestion. I think that, if you don't think so, I still think that you should be reading them for the first time in order of publication, if nothing else, but this is my suggestion. So that is my wrap up, and I have said absolutely nothing important, and I'll see you all next week.